Hello again, Dan Alasso, Making History, and I'm here today with another chapter from my biography of Dr. Charles Knowlton, an infidel body snatcher and the fruits of his philosophy. And this is chapter 33, and it is called A New Edition, and it's about a new edition of his book, The Fruits of Philosophy. And I begin, as always, with a quote from Knowlton himself. "The only seeming objection of much weight that can be brought against diffusing the knowledge of checks is that it will serve to increase illegal connections." Now, this is exactly the contrary effect of that which those who have diffused such knowledge most confidently believe will arise from it. To diminish such connections is indeed one of the grand objects of these publications, an object which laws and prisons cannot, or at least do not, accomplish. Why is there so much prostitution in the land? The true answer is not, and never will be, because the people have become acquainted with certain facts in physiology. And now my story. Abner Kneeland was an unflinching supporter of Knowlton and the Fruits of Philosophy from the start. So it's no surprise that when Charles revised and expanded the book in 1834, Kneeland became his publisher. The new version of Fruits of Philosophy was marked 3rd edition with additions. And the title page read, "By Charles Knowlton, M.D., author of Modern Materialism." The book was professionally printed in Boston on high-quality paper and bound in orange cloth. Like Knowlton's earlier self-published edition, the new Fruits of Philosophy was a palm-sized private companion that its owners could carry and could read discreetly. The 1834 Fruits of Philosophy was also 3 times as long as the previous editions. It contained 182 pages of text and an appendix that reprinted an article about the book that had run in Kneeland's Boston Investigator. Charles once again included his original philosophical proem and his account of Malthus's population question and the details of male and female anatomy and his birth control method. He added new discussions of medical issues related to sexuality, including sterility, impotence, and onanism. The moral argument of the new version of Fruits of Philosophy was unchanged. Quote, "When an individual gratifies any of his instincts in a temperate degree, he adds an item to the sum total of human happiness and causes the amount of human happiness to exceed the amount of misery, farther than if he had not enjoyed himself. Therefore, it is virtuous, or, to say the least, it is not vicious or sinful for him to do so. But it must ever be remembered that this temperate degree depends on circumstances, that one person's health, pecuniary circumstances, or social relations may be such that it would cause more misery than happiness for him to do an act, which, being done by a person under different circumstances, would cause more happiness than misery. Therefore, it would be right for the latter to perform such an act, but not for the former." Charles was expanding on the utilitarian moral argument he'd been making since medical school. Actions were good or bad depending on circumstances, he said. People could learn to live with this complexity and make their own choices, rather than taking refuge in absolutism and superstition. In the new edition, Charles gave a personal example of this argument, using a subject that hit very close to home: masturbation. Most physicians and moralists had not changed their opinions on the depravity and danger of masturbation in the decade since they'd convinced Charles that he was dying from self-abuse. Tissot's treatise on the diseases produced by onanism was still the best-selling authority on the subject. Charles had a copy of it in his medical library. But with the new edition of Fruits of Philosophy, Charles had the authority and the platform to offer his own opinion. Tissot's book, he said, was, quote, "filled with a collection of desperate cases, and when a young man ignorant of medicine reads these cases and the multitude of symptoms, which among all the cases he will meet with, he must be an uncommonly sound or healthy man, or he will believe that he has already done himself great, if not irreparable, injury. Tissot blamed so many conditions on masturbation and gave so many exaggerated examples that his aim was clearly a combination of alarmism and titillation, Charles suggested. Quote, "A man marries a young wife and in 3 weeks becomes blind and in 4 months dies. Another is attacked the day after marriage with acute fever, and 2 others a week after. Another has an epileptic fit, and all these diseases are attributed to venery as a matter of course. I do not believe that in any case more good than evil will arise from erroneous views or false coloring," Charles warned. In his experience, Charles said, the sensational way moralists like Tissot described the, quote, disease of masturbation and its effects was itself dangerous. Quote, "Let a young man once become possessed with the idea that his virility is impaired," Charles said, "and that sexual intercourse would greatly injure him, if not ultimately destroy, and, my word for it, his mind will wear out his machine faster than any degree of intemperance that is at all prevalent. Let him now have no advisor but Tissot's treatise, and he will certainly die. He was once, quote, intimately acquainted with a young man who had suffered from exactly this type of mental anguish," Charles continued. Physicians following the lead of moralists like Tissot had almost killed the boy, when the best remedy, as I have said before, is marriage. It restored the young man whose case I have just mentioned to health and strength in a few months, and he is now the father of several pretty healthy children. Charles included an article from the Investigator as an appendix to the edition. It answered 2 objections that had been raised to Fruits of Philosophy: that birth control would lead to licentiousness and prostitution, and that birth control was against nature. In the first case, Charles said, the opinions of everybody who'd studied the subject were against the idea that birth control would lead to looser sexual behavior. People delayed marriage because they feared the burden a large family would put on them, and this led to more sex outside marriage, and especially to prostitution. Everyone since Malthus, on both sides of the Atlantic, Charles said, agreed on the connection between late marriage and vice. For example, Charles continued, I might quote pages to the point from every woman's book, but I fear my communication would be too lengthy. I content myself with a few lines. Quote, but when it has become the custom here as elsewhere to limit the number of children so that none need have more than they wish, no man will fear to take a wife, all will marry while young, debauchery will diminish. End quote. The whole point of books like Richard Carlisle's, Robert Dale Owen's, and his own, Charles said, was to allow people to marry early and satisfy their needs without fearing the consequences. And as far as birth control being against nature was concerned, Charles responded that it all depended on how you defined nature. Quote, it has been said, it is best to let nature take her course, Charles said. Now, in the broadest sense of the word nature, I say so too. In this sense, there is nothing unnatural in the universe. But if we limit the sense of the word nature so as not to include what we mean by art, then is civilized life one continued warfare against nature. Like every technology since fire, Charles explained, medicine was mankind's attempt to improve on natural life. If they wanted to be consistent, people who objected to birth control because it was unnatural should also avoid houses, carriages, cooked food, and certainly books. This, of course, is my opinion, Charles concluded, but since I have probably reflected more upon the subject than all the persons concerned in my imprisonment put together, until it can be shown that I have not as clear a head and as pure a heart as any of them, I think it entitled to some weight. Abner Kneeland not only published the 1834 edition of Fruits of Philosophy, He sold it in his bookstore and in the pages of the Boston Investigator. Single copies were available for 50 cents. And approved booksellers could order Fruits of Philosophy at wholesale prices of 37.5 cents per copy for 100 books and 25 cents each for 500. Charles kept several hundred copies on hand in Ashfield, but after 1834, more copies of Fruits of Philosophy were delivered through the mail than were bought directly from the author. Copies of the new edition even found their way onto ships crossing the Atlantic. Before the end of 1834, Freethought publisher James Watson was selling his own version of Knowlton's book in London. Unfortunately for Abner Kneeland, publishing the Boston Investigator and a new edition of Fruits of Philosophy, running a society for free inquirers in Boston, and supporting radical social reforms all had their costs. The January 10th, 1834 issue of the Investigator carried a front-page headline announcing, quote, "The editor is indicted for blasphemy." Kneeland had been arrested for publishing 3 articles in the December 20th, 1833 issue. The first 2 were reprints of Francis Wright and Robert Dale Owen's New York Free Inquirer, a passage from Voltaire, and an article questioning the effectiveness of prayer. The third was an editorial comparing Kneeland's belief with those of the Universalists who had cast him out of their organization a few years earlier. The indictment claimed Kneeland's explanation of his personal beliefs violated Part 4, Title 1, Chapter 272, Section 36 of Massachusetts General Law. Quote, "Whoever willfully blasphemes the holy name of God by denying, cursing, or contumeliously reproaching God, his creation, government, or final judging of the world, or by cursing or contumeliously reproaching Jesus Christ or the Holy Ghost, or by cursing or contumeliously reproaching or exposing to contempt and ridicule the holy word of God contained in the Holy Scriptures, shall be punished by imprisonment in jail for not more than 1 year and by a fine of not more than $300, and may also be bound to good behavior." This section, incidentally, is still part of Massachusetts General Law. Kneeland had stated his beliefs in a published letter to Thomas Whittemore, president of the Cambridge Bank, congressman, and publisher of the Universalist paper The Trumpet. Whittemore, who had chaired the congressional committee that disestablished the Congregational Church in 1833, apparently believed people should be free to choose their religion, but not free to choose no religion. Kneeland had written, quote, "I still hold to universal philanthropy, universal benevolence, and universal charity. In these respects, I am still a universalist." But then he had continued, "Universalists believe in a God which I do not." Abner Kneeland's blasphemy case dragged on in Massachusetts courts for 5 years. But he stayed focused on publishing The Investigator and distributing Fruits of Philosophy and other freethought titles. In 1838, Francis Wright became a co-editor of the Boston Investigator to give Kneeland time to focus on his appeals. Abner's final appeal to the state's Supreme Court failed in 1839. The 64-year-old journalist was convicted and jailed for 60 days. When released, Kneeland left the state for Iowa and never returned. There is no record of how many booksellers ordered Fruits of Philosophy in bulk, but in the 5 years they collaborated on the book, Kneeland and Knowlton sold nearly 7,000 copies of the new edition. And that ends chapter 33. In chapter 34, we will talk about the reissue and revision of Robert Dale Owen's book, Moral Physiology, with, I think, the help of Charles Knowlton. But that's all for now. So I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you again